Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Good to see so many smiling faces.
Right.
Coming from that sound bar, so if you want it louder, just
Call her, and if she is going to come, well, you can both come down here.
So
'cause
just
it's
a reminder
Ferguson.
to mute your screen for now.
you see that?
Yeah.
We always give a few extra minutes for people to get in. I hope everyone's enjoying this weather. If you're from central Pennsylvania, it's been really nice lately. Finally. Do we have any out-of-staters?
Yeah, I see somebody from California.
All right. Another minute or so, and then we will get started. Thank you all for coming out this evening. See lots of familiar faces, a couple new faces. That's great. Hi, Jill. Good to see you.
Howdy, good to be here. Nice to see you.
I think we'll go ahead and get started. I think most of you know my name is Dwight Yoder. I'm an attorney at Gibbel Kraybill.
Disgraced ex-president who incited those rioters.
And Gibbel Kraybill Hess and Bethel AME Church have been partnering now. We were just talking about this. I think it's been over 3 years. We started the year before COVID hit with a series of seminars on the history of slavery and discrimination. We started doing these seminars at the church in person. We didn't quite know what to expect, but we had tremendous interest and went through some of the key time frames in U.S. history as it relates to slavery and the formation of our country and discrimination. And then after that, we've had seminars on more specific topics dealing with all different areas. And tonight we have a real interesting seminar. Reverend Bailey, anything you want to add here before we introduce Dr. Carey?
Yeah, I think we were really focusing on the laws, and we started with 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to see how the laws have impacted, or the lack of supporting those laws has impacted the nation that we are today, and things that we just did not know as a nation, what we weren't taught in school. So we got a chance to do some discussion around these things, that especially how much race has been affected in America, and it's still it's still that big horse that's sitting in the living room that nobody wants to talk about, and it's affecting all of us in both negative ways, and very little of it is positive. So we've been trying to get people to see that, and to be able to look at it and begin discussing what nobody wants to talk about. That's it for me.
Thanks, Reverend. So I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Greg Carey. He is a professor of New Testament at Lancaster Theological Seminar. He has taught at the seminary since 1999. He holds a BA from Rhodes College and Master's of Divinity from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and a PhD from Vanderbilt University. Greg teaches courses on the New Testament and on biblical and contextual interpretation, along with a doctoral seminar devoted to research methodologies. So we are really pleased to have Dr. Carey join us tonight, bring his expertise as a professor at Lancaster Theological Seminary, and be able to speak about Christian nationalism. Before we let Dr. Carey kind of take over and introduce himself and his presentation tonight, we always like to remind folks why we're doing this seminar. And for me, and we were just talking a little bit briefly before the seminar started, I look back and this is the 14th large group seminar that we've done. And for me, I can't believe how much I've learned about our history and how our country and the legacy of slavery and discrimination directly tie to so many of the challenges that we face today. And I've recognized that if you don't go back and get it, it's almost impossible, particularly for a white male as myself, to really be able to make a difference and understand what is happening today. And, you know, I see so much in today's political and social environment that ties directly to our history. It's kind of scary. And when you know some of the basics of our history, and then you see what happens today, it's not a surprise. So on that high note, Reverend Bailey, do you have anything you'd like to say?
I'm at the same way you are, and I've been very appreciative of Dwight taking up the challenge. You know, for years I've been in Lancaster, and people have called me racist and that I don't like white people and all that kind of craziness. And so when I see the word Sankofa, it means let's go back and get it. We really never started the country off right. It was at Reconstruction that we had an opportunity to do something right, and we still messed it up. And yet, when I talk about go back and get it, you know, there's a whole group of people who are going back and getting crazy stuff from the past, the most racist stuff, and they refuse to move from it. And yet we who say we're about truth and reconciliation, we're not willing to look into yesterday to find answers for what we need to tell us where we're going and where we need to go. And so this word Sankofa is very important to me. I never would have thought at 72, I never would have thought that we would be here today at 72. My mother always used to give me hope that tomorrow would be a better day. But being a prophet and listening to the voice of God, I fully understand that it is not a better day, that we have to make it a better day. And the only way that's going to happen is people have to be willing to work with the truth and be willing to say to people when they're not telling the truth, that's not true. And so I'm glad that we're able to do this. I'm glad Dr. Carey's with us. I've known him for a while now. We butted heads a couple of times, but he's been a good man. Because if you can't butt heads, my goodness, and be friends after, you have to be as iron sharpen iron. Nobody has all the truth in themselves. We get there by rubbing one another, hopefully in the right way, and hopefully we can do that tonight. I'm starting to preach now, so I'll shut up.
All right. One last thing before we turn it over to Dr. Carey is that we will have a small group session on October 19th. Dr. Carey has provided some resources that we're going to take a look at, and we'll get that information out for those who are interested. If you recall, this is an opportunity to go into breakout rooms of 3 to 5 people and be able to process some of the information we hear tonight, and also the assignment that you're given for the small group. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Dr. Carey, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Dwight. Thank you to Gibbel Kraybill and Hess, and Dr. Bailey. Yes, amen to all of that about us and about working together. And thank you to Bethel. I also want to thank Hannah for making all this work, apparently. It's an honor to be talking on this topic. I want to tell everybody what we're going to do, and then I do have slides that I'll share while I talk before we discuss. I want to describe what Christian nationalism is, because it's been in the news so much, but there's a lot of confusion about it. I want to talk a little bit about where it comes from and why it works the way it does. I want to do some analysis of Christian nationalism in terms of racism and really try to unpack what that is. I prefer to say white Christian nationalism, and to do some critique, theological critique about it. But, you know, the news has been on to Christian nationalism for about 2 years, I would say. I've been alarmed about it for 10 or 12. I'm not an expert. I just try to keep up with the experts and share what I learned, because I have been alarmed, increasingly alarmed over these years. So I like to start here with this verse from the biblical book of Galatians. You are called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Not only do not use your freedom as an opportunity of self-indulgence, but through love become enslaved to one another. I'm still working on that language of enslavement, which is very prominent in the Bible. But for the whole law is summed up in a single commandment: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. My basic critique of Christian nationalism is that Christian nationalism uses Christianity as a way not of offering love to our neighbors, but of dominating our society. And so rather than love and mutual care, it's about power. It's about a particular strand of Christians defining the world for everyone else. That's my concern, is the small group of Christians trying to dominate society. When I try to think of one image to say, what is this about? We might remember this moment, right? During the Black Lives Matter protests after the murder of George Floyd, there were protests in Washington, D.C. Donald Trump, who was then president, had the streets forcefully cleared, led a procession to St. John's Parish Church, an Episcopal church in Washington, and held up a Bible for a photo opportunity. What all is packed into that moment? Well, the church didn't want Donald Trump there. They said so. The Bible is clearly a prop. I don't know anyone who's ever read a Bible who's held it like that ever. And Donald Trump is famous for not being able to name his favorite book or his favorite verses. The Bible wasn't his, it was his daughter Ivanka's. So it's a prop. The church is a prop. And what are they props of? They're props of power. And we can't forget the moment. It's an attempt to assert government power, white power, over against a movement for racial justice. So you have all of that together in this picture. Christianity functioning as a symbol and a weapon, right? And in a way that you can't take away the question of race. One journalist who's done some really good work on Christian nationalism describes it as the idea that the United States is and ought to be a Christian nation governed under a reactionary understanding of Christian values. So one of the interesting things is that researchers have found most Christians, this would apply to white Christians, it would apply to Black Christians. If you ask, should America be a Christian nation, or is America a Christian nation? A slight majority of Christians would answer that question, yes. But if you start asking them what that means in terms of how government should look and how we should treat one another, what we began to find is a dramatic split between white and Black Christians on issues of public interest in terms of their opinions. And splits among white Christians too, that indicate that the point of view that we know as Christian nationalism now actually represents a significant but not huge percentage of Christian people. And of course, Christian people, I'm not in favor of Christian people at all dominating the United States, but just to be clear that it's a movement that isn't representative. We're seeing it here in Lancaster County. And if you're reading the Lancaster newspaper and you're local, there have been quite a few stories lately about Christian nationalist meetings, a Christian nationalist movie, the Republican, and I can't avoid politics this year, the Republican gubernatorial candidate of Pennsylvania is a Christian nationalist. So let's start to think about, how did we get this idea? As long as I've been alive, but probably as long as this nation has existed, there's been a thing called civil religion. As long as I've been alive, presidents have been public about their church membership, for example. They've finished speeches by saying, God bless the United States of America, or God bless our troops and bless the United States of America. There have been prayers at public events like football games and graduations and civic ceremonies and so forth. That kind of civil religion has been present. It has waxed and waned from one period to another in the history of this country. But if you ask the question, was America founded as a Christian nation? Which John Thea does, and John teaches at Messiah College, and it's become nationally recognized for his work on this. The answer to that question is, well, it's complicated. What colony are we talking about? Are we talking about the Pilgrims in Massachusetts? Yes, they were trying to build a particular kind of Christian society. But then Rhode Island was settled by people that the Puritans wouldn't tolerate, right? So they fled to Rhode Island for religious freedom. If we want to think about Maryland, we're thinking about Roman Catholics. If we think about Virginia, well, they were Anglicans, Episcopalians today, and not particularly motivated by religion in founding their state. It varies quite a bit from one part of the United States to the other, so that by the time the Constitution was drafted, it tries to make room for freedom from religion and freedom of religion at the same time. It's complicated. So as Pastor Bailey said, as we were beginning, there are a lot of people in the white evangelical world who go to great lengths to argue that America always has been and always should be Christian, and that those Christians back in the 18th century believed all the things that those Christians today do. And it's bad historiography. The work gets consistently reviewed and rejected by other historians, but it is a story that is very powerful in certain churches within the United States, and a great deal of time and money is spent to promote it. I would note that when the Confederacy developed a constitution, they made a point of naming their religious beliefs as part of the identity of the Confederacy. And they did that intentionally to distinguish themselves from the federal Constitution, which refused to take that step. So that's an interesting sort of mark, right, in the story. In the 20th century, we started seeing new forms of Christian nationalism emerging. There was a lot of fear in the 1930s about communism, and frankly, some big business concern about Roosevelt and the New Deal. And a lot of money went into promoting a certain kind of Christian nationalism as a way of resisting, first of all, liberal American politics, labor unions and so forth, but also a perceived threat of communism. James Fifield, who was the pastor of First Congregational in Los Angeles, once said that the way out for America is not ahead but back. How far back? Back as far as the old gospel, which exalted individuals, which placed responsibility for thought on individuals, and which insisted that individuals should be free spirits under God. And I know he was a pastor, but I was just wondering which gospel he got any of that from. Because none of that is exactly biblical or gospel stuff related to Jesus, but that's the way it was framed. We see it even today in the institution of the National Prayer Breakfast. The folks who sponsor the National Prayer Breakfast also host Bible studies at the U.S. Capitol. They publish these Bible studies. You can go online. And what you begin, and John Fia again wrote a Washington Post story about it, about this movement. When you read the Bible studies that are online, they are very specific about women being subordinate to men, about any kind of big government support for people who are poor or vulnerable being contrary to, in other words, the agenda is very, very, very biblical, very conservative politically, very partisan friendly, though they don't use partisan language in that kind of material. This has been going on for a while, and not from people who lack access to power. We've seen it change our denominations, especially in the evangelical world. So when I was introduced, it was mentioned that I'm a graduate of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, which is noted for being very, very, very conservative. It wasn't when I was a student, but one of the things that I would call attention to is Southern Baptists until the 1980s were probably the denomination in the United States that most strongly supported the separation of church and state. That may be hard for a lot of people to believe, but they were the largest donors to a group called the Baptist Joint Committee, which still exists, but Southern Baptists withdrew. Andrew Lewis, a scholar describing the history of abortion politics in the United States, writes that despite some criticism from the 40s to the 70s, Southern Baptist, if you're not familiar, the largest Protestant denomination by far, 15 million. Southern Baptist approved of this Baptist Joint Committee and the Supreme Court's separation of church and state positions. In 10 of 25 annual conventions, they passed resolutions opposing the use of public funds to support religious schools, hospitals, and other institutions. They are the exact opposite today, as are most evangelicals. Most white evangelicals used to fear the government. Now they want the government's money and they want control of the government. And so that this is a major change. I also would like to discuss a couple of threads in white Christian nationalism that most people aren't aware of. If I talked about conservative white Christianity, a lot of you would think about, here's a picture of Jerry Falwell and the moral majority. You might think about Franklin Graham. You might think about Ralph Reed or Al Mohler. You know, a traditional Protestant, guys with silver hair in dark suits and white shirts. Sorry, Dwight. But you think of a certain kind of institutional Christianity. That's there and it is still present. But we have, over the past 25 years, but gaining a lot of momentum over the past 10, a different movement on the wings of Pentecostal or charismatic Christianity. It's called the New Apostolic Reformation. And it's a movement of preachers and teachers who claim to get direct messages from God. And the messages that they receive from God have really more functional authority in their communities than Scripture does. When you think about Donald Trump in the White House surrounded by preachers, a lot of those were New Apostolic Reformation people. Paula White would be one. Lance Wellnow, who's pictured here, is one. And so knowing that these are two streams of Christianity that when I was a Southern Baptist back in the 80s, they would not have gotten along at all, would have considered each other to be competitors and just fundamentally wrong. But in the interest of Christian nationalism, do a lot of work together. So we'll pay attention to that a little bit. A lot of people also don't know that that moral majority stream of Christianity got its start out of segregation. So Paul Weyrich, who was one of the political organizers of the moral majority and the religious right, once said at a gathering celebrating their progress in the 1990s that the religious right did not come together in response to the Roe decision about abortion. Because if you can go back to the 70s and 80s, what they wanted to talk about was prayer in schools, abortion, and gay rights. Those were their causes. But that's not why they got started. Weyrich said, what got the movement going as a political movement was the attempt on the part of the Internal Revenue Service to rescind the tax-exempt status of Bob Jones University because it was segregationist and continued to ban interracial dating until the year 2000. This university is in Greenville, South Carolina. Bob Jones wanted federal government money, student loans and other kind of funding that other academic institutions receive. And the federal government said, you can't have federal funding if you practice racial discrimination. Bob Jones said, well, then we just won't take the money. We'd rather have our racial discrimination. They organized, decided that that wasn't the issue that would win the day politically, because it wasn't. And so they settled on abortion, prayer in schools, and gay bashing, essentially, as the issues that they would gather around. These days, it's a little different. Dayspring Christian Academy here had Charlie Kirk, who was working for Liberty University very recently as their spring fundraising speaker. They publish a fundraising magazine regularly. It's always not about loving your neighbor or following Jesus or praying more. It's always about culture war issues from the right wing. What they wanted to talk about at that time was they just can't stand critical race theory. Now, I can tell you that very few evangelicals could have known what critical race theory is 3 years ago. I've been working with it a lot in my own teaching and New Testament scholarship, but nobody knew what it was until it became a wedge issue that certain kinds of conservative Christians could use to stir up a lot of anxiety among white Christians. And let's face it, the fact that it has to do with race and racism, as Pastor Bailey says, he gets called racist. Why? Because he tells the truth about race. Right? That is part of this movement. So I just wanted to give some flavor of what the movement kind of looks like before getting into talking about it in a little more of a granular detail. A lot of Christians will say, well, is Christian nationalism Christian? Aubrey Hendricks, who's a Black New Testament scholar and friend of mine, wrote a book, published it 2 years ago, called Christians Against Christianity: How Right-Wing Evangelicals Are Destroying Our Faith and Our Nation. And I think Aubrey has it basically right. Yes, they're Christian. Everything that Christian nationalists are doing, Christians have done at other points in the history of the world. But what they're doing is also a toxic form of Christianity. And I rely heavily on a couple of sociologists named Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, who have written the best sort of analysis of what Christian nationalism is in terms of how it works that I know of. It's called Taking America Back for God, and it came out in 2020. They're sociologists, so you have to be willing to go through their charts and graphs and all of that to read it. But here's another image to help us get a sense of what it is as an interpretation of Christianity. This came out 2 years ago when most of us were masking when we were in public places, especially inside. And I saw it on Twitter. I snapshotted it. I wish I kept the documentation, but notice the image. The church in 2020, sheep wearing masks. Well, nobody wants to be a sheep wearing masks. Wouldn't you rather be a lion on the prowl, right? Except for a couple of things. In the New Testament, Jesus calls himself a shepherd. And the book of Revelation, literally in chapter 5, when it begins to introduce Jesus, says, hey, you're going to get a lion here. The Lion of Judah has conquered. And then John looks, the visionary in Revelation, he doesn't see a lion. A lion never shows up in Revelation. In Revelation, Jesus is, guess what? The Lamb, all the way through. The way I'd like to put it is, in the book of Revelation, Jesus exercises power by being a lamb. And what Christian nationalism want is lion power, domination, roaring, stamping, tearing kind of power. So Whitehead and Perry look at all kinds of survey data, and there are 6 questions in some major surveys that come out of Baylor University that they lock into to help them identify what a Christian nationalist is. Do you think the government should call the United States a Christian nation? That the government should explicitly advocate Christian values? Do you think the government should enforce separation of church and state? Notice that that's in blue because Christian nationalists will say no to that, whereas they say yes to the other questions. That it should allow the display of religious symbols in public places, that the success of the United States is a part of God's plan, that the government should allow prayer in public schools. They look at people's responses to each of these questions on a scale of 1 to 4. And if they score 24, they answer the Christian nationalist way with strongly agree all the way across, then that's a strong Christian nationalist. And if they score 0, I would, then they're a person who rejects Christian nationalism. Let me show you a graph of something that they've found out. So here are those 24 points on the bottom row. And notice the question is, when people have a strong belief, how confident are they that they're right, even when they're given evidence that they're wrong? And what you see is, the more strongly people identify with Christian nationalism, the less responsive they are to information that challenges their own point of view, even when they're wrong. Right? One thing you might want to take from that is, it's never worth your time to have an argument with a Christian nationalist. You can talk with them and communicate and ask questions and share your point of view, but don't even try to argue. It literally is counterproductive. Whitehead and Perry argue that from a sociologist's perspective, that Christian nationalism often influences Americans' opinions and behavior in the exact opposite direction than traditional religious commitment does. So, for example, because we're talking about Christians and white Christians, if you're a Christian and have been for a long time, you may wonder, how did it come that these Christians came to believe that? And the answer is, they've been influenced by Christian nationalism over the past few years. Let me show you a few examples. All of the next few slides, and I'm going to move through them quickly because I'm not trying to just snow you under with data, but to sort of make a point. All the slides I'm about to show are people who identify as Christian nationalists are more likely to hold these opinions than the rest of the population is. More likely to approve of authoritarian tactics like demanding that people show respect for national symbols and traditions. Think of football players kneeling during the national anthem. Can't tolerate that. Christian nationalists are more likely to fear and distrust religious minorities, including Muslims, atheists, and Jewish people. Think about the response to immigration among Christian nationalists today, as opposed to it used to be that the first people in society to run to the aid of refugees, for example, in Lancaster County was Christians. More likely to condone police violence toward Black Americans and distrust accounts of racial inequality in the criminal justice system. Robert P. Jones, who's coming to Harrisburg, October the 6th, has written a book called White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, which I require my students to read. And he documents that when we come to these kinds of issues, the split between white Christians and Black Christians is, well, scandalous. If you add on a series of issues, related to criminal justice, poverty, access to education, voting, you name it, on a series of issues, white Christians stand farther apart from Black Christians than does any other demographic group. White atheists are far closer to Black Christians than white Christians are. And then, as you might imagine, on that scale, but as Pastor Bailey said earlier tonight, no white Christians get off the hook on this. But white evangelicals are the farthest extreme of that. So, a few of these questions that Whitehead and Perry. Christian nationalists are more likely to believe that racial inequality is due to the personal shortcomings of minority groups. It's your fault. They're more likely to report being very uncomfortable with interracial marriage and transracial adoption. They're more likely to hold anti-immigrant views. They're more likely to express fear of refugees. They're more likely to oppose scientists and science education in school. In Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania, white nationalists on the school board are trying to get the school to stop teaching evolution in biology class, right? If you wondered why so many conservative Christians suddenly denied the science on COVID or deny the science on climate change, the answer to this is it's been in their DNA for generations. Like, this distrust has been there, but it is growing, boiling. I'm going to start losing track of my metaphors. It's becoming more and more intense in our society. They're more likely to believe that men are better suited for leadership roles in business, in government, in church, at home, while women are better suited to care for children in the home. So when you see certain kinds of attacks of women who are in politics, for example, this is part of that. And as I'm beginning to move, I'm starting to move a little bit toward then why is white Christian nationalism, I hope by now it's clear why I'm saying white Christian nationalism, right? Why is it also a danger to democracy? And here's the next one. Here's that same chart with the 24 points, right? Is voting a right or a privilege? The more strongly a person identifies with Christian nationalist ideas, the more likely they are. And notice this is more than half to think voting is a privilege rather than a right. So right now, the Republican candidate for governor in Pennsylvania has said that if he's elected, he's going to scratch the voting records, start over with new registrations, empower the Secretary of State to determine election. What's going on with restricting access to voting. One of the slides as we were opening showed a long line of voters. I don't know where. I did notice that most of them were Black it is, as a matter of fact, harder to vote in the United States if you're Black or brown or young or really old than it is if you're white and in the middle of those things, right? Christian nationalists are more likely to be okay with that. A recent poll that just came out that I haven't even looked up and put in here because I can't document it, about a third of Americans would say they would rather have a strong, unelected leader than a weak elected leader. This is the kind of threat it is. One sociologist at the University of Minnesota talked about people who are what he calls high in public religious expression, PRE. Think about the people who put a Jesus sticker on their car or wear Jesus t-shirts or whatever else. I would never put a Jesus sticker on my car because one day I'm going to cut somebody off and they're going to say, see, that's how all those Christians are. So I'm just not. But people who tend to do that are also more likely to show intolerance toward groups they dislike, to be less tolerant of others. We saw a lot of Christian nationalist language and symbolism in the assault on the Capitol on January 6, 2021. And Whitehead and Perry say this brand of religious nationalism appears to be unmoored from traditional Christian ideals and morality, also inclined toward authoritarian figures. Let's think about this issue. There are countries in the world right now where democracy is really all but dead. Russia. Here's Franklin Graham with Vladimir Putin. And there have been many times when Franklin Graham has defended Vladimir Putin in public. This is Lance Wellnow, one of those new prophet apostles, saying it's hard to make Putin the villain in the war with Ukraine if you have all the facts. Because the CIA and Hillary Clinton tried to undercut Putin by injecting the LGBTQ doctrine into Russia. I didn't know we did that. I hope you hear the sarcasm. And Putin clamped down like a good dictator does. The most recent Republican candidate for Senate out of Delaware said that she identifies with Putin's Christian values more than she did with Joe Biden. After the most recent presidential election, Mark Meadows, Donald Trump's chief of staff, was writing Jenny Thomas, who's married to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, saying this is a fight of good and evil. Evil always looks like the victim until the King of Kings triumphs. Don't grow weary in well-doing. The fight continues. I've staked my career on it. Twice, the most prominent gathering of right-wing conservatives in the United States, CPAC, Conservative Political Action Conference, has had as its speaker Viktor Orban of Hungary, who has just about extinguished democracy in Hungary. If you can imagine an American political gathering, they met in Hungary in May and brought Orban to Texas during the summer. So we have Doug Mastriano running for governor. And when he describes his outlook on these things, he says, God is really working in our state. In November, we're going to take our state back. My God will make it so. And I am, as I'm sure you are, always confused about who's taking what back from whom, who owns it to take it back, right? But that's Mastriano's take. Because Bethel is one of our sponsors, I'm comfortable talking about this movement theologically, and this will be the last set of remarks that I have, and we can have question and answer. I want to talk about why Christian nationalism isn't just bad for democracy or that it's bad historiography, but why it's bad for the church. And I say that, or bad for the gospel, bad for Christianity. If you really pay attention to Christian nationalist preachers and teachers, they almost never talk about Jesus as anything but a symbol. They don't have anything to say about love your neighbor. They don't have anything to say about turn the other cheek. They don't have anything to say about the Good Samaritan or the prodigal son. They have nothing to say about the gospel is good news for the poor and release to the captives. Who Jesus was and what he did and what he said is pretty much absent from the movement. They will talk about Jesus and they'll talk about the cross, but the cross is really a flag. It's a symbol, but they would never talk about becoming weak in order for God to work through you, or sacrificing your own prerogatives and your own status for the welfare of those who are disadvantaged, which is how the Apostle Paul interprets the cross. They just want the cross to be, this is us. There should be crosses everywhere. Jesus' ministry, he often said, don't be like the Gentiles who try to lord over each other, but learn how to become the least in the community, learn how to serve each other, learn how to love one another. The greatest is the one who learns to serve. In the New Apostolic Reformation stream of Christianity, and this has spread to broadly in Christian nationalism, they talk about something else. They talk about the 7 mountains of culture, taking dominion over the 7 mountains of culture. And they name them. It's like government, media, entertainment, finance, education, commerce. Yeah. And I'm going to run out, but they talk about dominion, not service. The Christian nationalists argue that God has some kind of special relationship with the United States that God doesn't have with other nations. That runs totally contrary to a gospel that embraces people of, as the book of Revelation puts it, every tribe and people and tongue and nation. And so it misplaces loyalty, right? It places loyalty. In fact, just this past week, a new book came out. I don't know if it's representative. I don't know how widespread it is. I just saw that it's out. Donald Trump, the Son of Man. I mean, what that book title means is Donald Trump as Jesus coming back to earth. Now, I have no idea how it will sell, how many people buy into it. But when you have a level of loyalty placed on politicians, on a political party, and frankly, on a single political leader, that's always going to diminish loyalty to Jesus. And so Christianity becomes a weapon. And I'd like to say a word about the attitude of Christian nationalists toward refugees and immigrants, because we just saw governors in Texas and Florida deceiving, maybe kidnapping people seeking asylum, people who are legally here seeking asylum, and shipping them to places that they didn't want to go or on false pretenses. The Bible is pretty clear on, in fact, in the book of Leviticus and in Deuteronomy, it tells Israel, love the migrant as you love yourself. Love the migrant as one of you. Or for Jesus, love your neighbor. There is none of that. I'm not exaggerating. None of that in Christian nationalist political rhetoric. And so if you have that relative or friend or coworker who always seems angry because they're Christian nationalists, it's because the messages they're getting from their preachers and from their media are constantly trying to keep them angry and resentful. Here's the one final thing. Robert Jones points this out. Christian nationalists are more likely than other Americans to believe that the most oppressed group in the United States is white evangelicals. They believe it. And if you listen to Fox News or you go to their churches, you'll hear it. They literally teach each other that they are the ones who are disadvantaged in this society. So we're back to our screen. That's the end of the formal presentation. I trust Pastor Bailey and Mr. Yoder to help us field conversation. I'm a classroom teacher. I'm happy to be part of that.
Thank you, Dr. Carey. Excellent presentation. I was jotting down notes. Reverend Bailey, any comments you'd like to make before we open it up for questions?
I thought it was an excellent presentation, Doc. And, there were some eye-opening things you gave tonight that you didn't even give in your last presentation, which makes it much more scarier, even though I've been afraid for the last 10, 15 years. But when your presentation makes it even that much more frightening, and that how hoodwinked not only the white Christian nationalists is, but those Christians who don't think that they are part of that group, who actually applaud and say amen to what they are saying. And what great presentation tonight, Doc.
Thank you.
And I would encourage people, that book, The 7 Cultures, The 7 Mountains of Culture, is a cheap book. It's on sale. You can buy it for, I think, $12, $14 to hear how other people really are thinking what Doc was saying. And you'll see that people are actually putting that stuff in writing and buying it. And so excellent presentation, Dr. Carey. So we want to open up for questions, and if you don't, try not to make them too long, and a question should be a question. And if you have something you want to, an opinion you would like to express, then say that. But I think it's open, right, Doc? Dwight?
Absolutely. And I'll let y'all tell me when we're done. I see Doug Anthony has his hand up.
Thank you for your presentation. Can you say a little bit more from a sort of proactive stance about what the theology is? You talked a lot about what it isn't. Can you say more about what's at the core of it?
Yeah, so one source of the theology comes from a stream of Presbyterianism. Probably not most of the Presbyterians around here, though I could name some churches. But you can look up a guy named R.J. Rushdoony, R-U-S-H-D-O-O-N-Y, who wrote a major book called The Institutes of Something. And he argues that Christians should try to enforce biblical law on every level of society. For Rushdoony, that meant if somebody's gay, they should be executed. It meant that if a woman is caught in premarital sex, she should be executed. That if a child is rebellious, they should be executed. And he was a segregationist. His favorite American theologian was a guy named Dabney, who was the #1 theological supporter of slavery during the 19th century. Their theology really revolves, as far as its Christian nationalists, around God wants the United States, and through the United States, all nations, to submit to God's law. Now, theologically beyond that, you'll have Baptists and Pentecostals and often some other brands, but a lot of Baptists and Pentecostals who, do they believe that Jesus was God come to earth? Yes. Do they believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Yes. Do they believe that Jesus died for our sins? Yes. They're not remarkable in that way. And so if you go to one of their churches, 9 out of 10 Sundays, they may be talking about those things. But what you'll see, like in this Dayspring Christian Academy, is you won't see their theology. You'll see the culture war issues that they're fighting, because that's where the energy is in that movement. That's a great question, actually. Yeah.
How did you spell that brother's name again, Doc?
RUSHDOONY. Very influential, by the way, very influential in homeschooling, because Christian nationalists tend to be highly critical of public schools. Doug Mastriano wants to eliminate property taxes in Pennsylvania, which is essentially a way to eliminate public education.
I have a
Jill?
question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for speaking with us. I mean, this lands on the body violently, and as someone engaging, trying to not totally intellectualize it and allow it to penetrate.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, for you who have been studying and engaging with the idea for 10 to 15 years, I'd be just curious for your survival or your self-care or your ideas of how you day by day take a step that hopefully makes a difference.
In a longer version of this presentation, I talk about that. I believe it's really essential to keep your heart soft, whether that's through prayer and devotional practices and worship and community, or finding people to love and hug. I have a lot of personal hurt and resentment. Since January 6th, my dad has quit reaching out to me. So yeah, you're right. And I'm a white guy who, has a certain kind of job in a certain place in society and certain set of resources. I'm not the primary target of this stuff.
But
So,
Dr. Carey, I would disagree with that part. I said
Okay.
that for years they've lifted persons who look like me up as the boogeyman. And January 6th says they're not coming after me. They wanted to hang the vice president of the United States. So a lot of white people who think they're safe, they also are in danger, and they don't see it because they're white. It's just like some of the Black people who were there on January 6th thought they would be protected because they were with white people, and that's a myth. January 6th said to me that it's not me they're after alone.
they are certainly after professors, and I'm one. Certainly. So that's well taken, Pastor.
And white politicians and anybody who doesn't believe what they believe.
Reporters, artists.
Yes.
Yep.
I'd like to ask a question. I'm watching on PBS the United States and the Holocaust, and I see how all that turns around. Hitler was blaming all the Jews for all their problems, and I know you said this distrust is in there, in the national Christian nationalism. It's taking America back.
Yeah.
Is that a move they have to make America white again?
I mean,
Lily white. This is white. This is what Hitler wanted. No, even children who were deformed, is to rid them of their lives and stuff. When I heard you saying it's their distrust is in their DNA, that goes way, way back from parents teaching them.
Yes. Are you Miss Bailey?
Yes. Let me put.
So hi there.
Hi.
So, I don't think we should think Nazi, but Nazi wasn't the only kind of fascist. I think the country we should look at is Hungary. So, and the reason I say that is because they talk about Hungary all the time. And I mentioned how they've reached out to Viktor Orban and made him a model. If you watch Tucker Carlson on Fox News, he talks about Orban a lot. What's happening in Hungary is anyone who doesn't fit that image or conform to it finds themselves suppressed. That's not the same as being tortured or sent to a labor camp. It means you'll be stripped of your resources, your access to social goods. You'll be kind of squashed. So, for example, I'm going to tie this to the question that Cindy Jennings put in chat. What about immigrants, children, and adults born with disabilities, the elderly, the poor? Because they have this authoritarian mindset, and because it's so shaped by a certain kind of racial outlook, racism, they regard people who are poor or in need as responsible for their own problems. So they don't feel compassion for immigrants. They might feel compassion for adults born with disabilities. And the way you see it, whatever your attitude is about abortion, which I consider a truly complicated moral question, whatever your attitude is, whatever you think about it, when you see this strong pro-life movement among Christian nationalists, what you don't see is a commitment to children's health care, to preschool education, to food programs for children. In other words, got to have the baby, but then you're on your own. And I think Hungary more than say a Hitler, in that form of what kind of society would it be if you were Black or brown or Asian American, but you conform to those values, then they won't come after you on that basis. But if you say, hey, we're not, you're putting all the waste treatment places in our neighborhood, or you're defunding the schools that serve our children, and you make noise about that, yeah, you would be squashed. I think
So
that's
it's almost like bowing down to the beast.
I think so. That's my opinion, right? Just
Yeah.
my opinion.
But Doc, wouldn't you
Thank
say
you.
also that just like in Germany, they came after a certain group and other groups thought they were safe, and then they found out that they were not safe. And before you knew it, in Germany, they had got rid of so many different groups. There's 6 million Jews, but there's 5 million other groups of people that they got rid of, so that nobody is safe in that kind of thinking. It may look like it in the beginning, that they're not coming after you, but maybe your nose is on the wrong side of your face and you think you're safe, and they'll come after you next. That's how I see it. And it happened in Germany. It's always like, you're my friend. I don't mean you, but the next thing you find out, they do mean you because you're not like them.
I personally don't think that that's what's motivating them. I think what they want is control rather than to eliminate. But when you read somebody like Rushduni, though, you go back to that, yeah, that would be very Nazi adjacent. So I'm certainly not in a position to rule that out.
Yeah.
But I do think that what we see in like Russia and Hungary is more like it, where as long as you lay low, you just kind of get breezed by. I think that's more what they want is submission. Yes, Reverend Harper?
So my question is, if my neighbor, Doug Mastriano, because I'm in Franklin County.
Oh, hi.
Hi. So if he doesn't win, then is that where the issue is going to be, that it was stolen election?
To me, it's a wait and see because I haven't heard him say that, but he has certainly been one of the election deniers from 2020. And it's becoming more and more common with Republican candidates to deny elections. So I would just say, let me put it this way, I'm a poll watcher this year. Right. I think we have to be vigilant about the right to vote. I don't know what else to say, because if we miss this one in Pennsylvania, the right to vote is going to get crushed and a lot of other things are going to get crushed. And if we miss it in 2024, you can bet the right to vote will be crushed. We're in a lot of danger for that. And that's what Orban's done. He's made it impossible to lose.
Dr. Carey, I have a question. It's a little bit different than what you talked about, but it's something that you might be able to answer, which is there's been some crazy things that seem to be now mainstream. And one of those things is this group called QAnon.
Yes.
I had really, all I know is that this just sounds crazy, but apparently there was a rally in the last week or two, and there's some symbol or signal that people, or a song. And I'm just curious, is this QAnon movement have any connection to anything you talked about, or is it just an unrelated fringe belief system?
That's a really sticky question. I would say that there are some overlap. So, by the way, Donald Trump sent out on his social media platform a picture of him wearing a Q pin this week. So what I will tell you is that in white evangelical Christianity, a certain kind of conspiracy thinking has been there the whole time. And it runs along with their end time prophecy belief that is so popular. Back when there still were Christian bookstores, the Bible prophecy section would be the biggest section except the Bibles, right? Talking about we're living in the end times kind of theology. So in that white evangelical world, there's been a lot of denial of climate change, for example, a lot of denial of evolution. You saw how it went with white evangelical churches and COVID protocols. And so QAnon runs in a very similar way. And what I think, this is just me, what I think we see is that in those circles, untruth and distortion amplifies and escalates. It doesn't just spread, it explodes. Because one person goes over here and stakes out some ground over here. If you want to get attention in that world, you have to go past that the next time, and past that and past that. So that just on TV this week, Michael Flynn, who was our national security advisor, right, responsible for national intelligence, Michael Flynn said they're trying to change our DNA with the COVID vaccine on TV. And if they can't do that, they're going to start injecting robotics into us. I don't know what to say other than that once your canoe starts drifting down that stream, it seems to want to go toward a waterfall. I just don't know what else. And by the way, thank you for laughing, because I made that up right now. It was really good. But you can tell I'm worked up about it. It alarms me greatly.
What are, you said that they're working on like end time theories? What I was in Park City and a sales clerk, nicest lady that I was talking to, and she talked about she just became a Christian, and then she went off the deep end for me because she started talking about something that's supposed to be happening soon. So when you mentioned that, you know, she didn't say exactly what it was, but it was the I left her. She started talking about Trump and
Mhm.
having doubles and all, but I left her with the last scripture that you said, thou shalt love the Lord thy God. Well, that's what I left her with. And then I just prayed for her.
Bless you, Miss Anderson.
She's the first person that I personally have run into that it was speaking, and it was like, oh my God. And she's standing in the store being friendly to other people, but she's telling other people that she gave me a website to look it up. Yeah. And it was like, when I looked it up, it's like, oh, okay, that just verifies, like, yes. I said, the verse that I left her with was like I said, the Bible, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul and all thy mind. Yes. And then the second is like unto love thy neighbor as thyself. That's what I left her with, because she was taught something's coming up. That's what she told me.
You did the model thing. Miss Anderson, you did the model thing. You gave her love.
Yeah.
You didn't feed into that stuff. And I don't think you can do better. I really, there are people I will say to them, I love you, but I'm not here for that conversation.
Yeah, I left. That's what I left her with. It was like,
yes.
But she, like you say, she was indoctrinated in whatever, and she was just right there. But she was willing to share. She's sharing with those people, it's like, Lord help.
That kind of end time teaching is more prominent among white evangelicals than you may realize. And just to give one example, one person who wrote a bestseller about Jesus is coming soon was Billy Graham. Jerry Falwell preached it regularly. So I guess I need to move to the next question. But
we as Christians, we know that I think we are in end times, but she was like, something's happening very soon. It's like, what's happening? But it was like, yeah, okay.
I think the reason that we have you with us tonight, Doc, is because too long people have been quiet.
Yes.
So we're trying to give folk answers, because you can't stay silent. I know you said we shouldn't argue with those folk, but I think the problem has been the good people, or the people who are thinking correctly or want to seek the truth, have been silent.
Yes.
Somehow, and maybe you can answer ways that we could do this. This is one way, but what are some other ways that people can speak the truth to this darkness that's coming, and not sit here and wait till it overflows us and then wonder how we got caught up in it?
I have been reading some psychology about that. I just want to acknowledge the time, because I see that Ms. Rivera also has a question. So, earlier I said, don't argue. There's good psychological reason to say don't argue, and also don't respond with anger if you can. But what I would say is, it is just like you're saying, it's very important to say, I don't believe that. That's not my understanding of Jesus. If you're Christian, my understanding of Jesus is that he's about loving and giving and healing and not dominating. To say what you believe, but not to get into an argument, certainly not to get into the latest conspiracy theory or, whatever happened to Hunter Biden's laptop or whatever they want to talk about. And so don't be silent, but also be willing to say, okay, I can't keep having this conversation, right? You have a right not to be sort of verbally assaulted. But I do agree with you, being silent is not going to get us through this. I saw the other question. Is it Mariana?
Yes, Mariana. Well, I'll just say three quick things. While you were speaking, and even now, I just have this visceral feeling of nausea, number one. Number two, it's been for a while, I know a lot of whites are panicked because of that magical year of 2440, when supposedly whites are no longer going to be in the majority, you know, and so they equate that as not having power, and they're all up about that. And number three, I was just back there in Pennsylvania. My one sister-in-law is a total Trumper, but we had a discussion where, and like she said something, I said something, they were completely different, but neither of us got raised voices or any of that stuff. And I was impressed with how she kept saying, well, we can have an argument or we can disagree and it was okay, you know? That's my bit.
I appreciate that. I don't think there's any question that there's a sense among white Americans of anxiety. I can't document this, but I heard recently that the class of kids who just finished high school is the first class in our history that had no racial majority. And there are states that have no racial majority. If you want to know why they're going crazy in Texas, it's because they know they can't hold on to that white conservative line forever. And so they're trying to build a wall around it, right? You know, and I think a lot of that runs at a level for many white people that's unconscious. And then there's another level where it gets said out loud. That's your language about taking America back, right? From whom?
Yeah.
To what? What was the time when things were great in this country? And if they were great, who are they great for? I think you're naming that issue. And I mentioned that Robert Jones is coming to Harrisburg next month. He also is a former Southern Baptist, and he's a sociologist. And I mentioned that book, White Too Long. He talks about his earlier book was The End of White Christian America, that demographic is just no longer dominant anymore. So I see there's another question. I also know we're on the time boundary. So I just want to check in.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
Yep. We do want to leave a little bit of time. Jill's agreed to maybe do a little decompressing with the group at the very end. So maybe another question or two.
Why not the one question that I see from Kathy Clark?
Hi, I just wanted to, you know, most people on this call right now, I'm sure at the churches that we go to, there probably are not any Christian nationalists there. So, but we all know those churches who do possibly have them. Like I happen to know some people from Westminster Presbyterian, and that's a very large church. And they will only preach, they always say that they will just preach the gospel. But, you know, that church is kind of concerning to me because they present like this very perfect church. So I'm just wondering, do we reach out to these churches that we know have Christian? Do we reach out to them by a letter? Do we say, please speak out against Christian? I mean, what can we do about the churches we know that have Christian nationalists?
Well, I can tell you that Westminster Presbyterian in Lancaster was at the Manheim Township School Board meeting, the pastor and several members trying to get a policy against transgender athletes.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, that's one of those issues that they've picked up that, you know, people are going to be upset about this. We can use that. We can split people. I don't think, I'll say two things. I don't think it's a good approach to go to churches and say, stop doing what you're doing, because,
okay,
you know, not as an individual. Now, in the 60s, there used to be, you know, sit-ins in segregated churches. That would be a different kind of witness. I also think, though, that every white church has Christian nationalists in it. Everyone. And you may or may not hear it, but I remember the Sunday after 9/11, one of our members took the flag from the side of the sanctuary and put it right in the middle of the altar. Right. And he didn't think he was doing anything wrong. He was a military veteran. He was as upset as we all were on that Sunday, but that was his response. Right, was to put the US flag, to put instead of the cross, the flag. And I think that's in every white church and a lot of other churches. So I'm aware there's more process. So I'll just say right now, I really appreciate that y'all have stayed with this and in this conversation. I'm really grateful for that. Thank you all.
I have a commercial, Dwight, on this. I belong to a group called Power, who is doing a bus across Pennsylvania to give the other answer that the white Christian nationalist is not giving, to tell people what the truth is, that Christians do believe in public school. I mean, basically what Brother Carey was giving us tonight, that we believe in loving our neighbor, helping our neighbor, and believing, we don't believe America is a Christian nation. We believe it has Christians in the nation. So if you want more information on that, I'll put something online to Hannah. If she will put it on for me, we can do that. The other thing too, another commercial is, we are starting our living experience up again after COVID, which is a reenactment for the Underground Railroad, about the Underground Railroad, and we would welcome anybody to come. It gives you an opportunity to live the experience. Someone said earlier that that whites are feeling like they're becoming a minority. Well, in many states during slavery, whites were the minority, and just had the power, but there were more blacks than there were whites in those states. So if we can look at the Underground Railroad and talk about the stories, I think it would be helpful to all of us. So you'll get some information on that. I just want you to know that we do it. And I really appreciate you tonight, Dr. Greg. I think you're an excellent teacher and very clear and concise, the things that you said. And I wish we had more sessions, and maybe up the road, we can do another session around this if you agree to come back, and we'll talk about it as a small group.
Anytime I can be helpful, anytime, you know that.
I know that. Dwight, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks,
wonderful.
everybody. Thanks, Dr. Carey. Jill Hine, who is part of our small group leadership team, chatted with me and said, this has been a fairly intense seminar, and it might be worth taking a few moments here to decompress a little bit. And so Jill, do you want to kind of take us through that process?
Yeah, sure. I know it was for myself, and I know often, particularly in white spaces, we can keep things intellectualized and we don't really think much about our bodies. And so I know for myself, just the idea of doing some deep breathing here. So I'll just guide us in some deep breathing and then 30 seconds of silence. And then maybe when we're finished, when we're all off Zoom, feel free to shake it off or do whatever you need to do to shake off the stuff that we've heard, so that we can allow it to penetrate and God, if we're Christians or if we're not, but just so we can be directed into some sort of action and not just paralyzed. So you may be familiar with box breathing. I'll just count out loud, but think if you can envision a box. I'll breathe in for 3 seconds and I'll count, and then we'll hold for 3 seconds and then we'll breathe out, and we'll just do that a couple times. So go ahead and breathe in. 1, 2, 3. Hold. 2, 3. Release. 2, 3. Hold. 2, 3. Breathe in. 2, 3. Hold. 2, 3. Release. 2, 3. Hold. 2, Great. All right, and I'll set a timer and we'll just have 30 seconds of just silence before Dwight or somebody takes us home. So just join me in silence. All right, thank you so much. I needed it, so thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Jill. Want to thank Dr. Carey again. And I want to thank all of you that came this evening and gave us your attention and time. Thank you very much. Reverend Bailey, anything you want to add?
No, I agree with you. I'm thanking people, and I hope people will speak about what we're doing and also will show up for the small groups so we can have further discussion. You know, people are always asking, what can I do? Well, here's the thing you can do. Meet with us in the small group. Let us hear what you have to say and what your thinking is, and things that you might be open to doing. And I want to say it again. The good people always stay quiet. And that's why the bad people always win. Because the good people don't say anything. And the bad people always win. If we remember, Germany was a democracy before Hitler came to power. And so it's not hard to lose what we have. And if you don't say anything, you don't speak up, and you allow being timid to keep you, it just is not going to work. And I love this nation. I love it enough to fight for it. And that's in prayer as well as to stand on the corner and tell people what the truth is. We need to be able to do that. So hopefully you'll be in a small group and not get afraid of having one-on-one conversation. We need to be able to talk and be friends and learn about one another. I'll shut up. Go ahead, Dwight.
Thank you, Reverend. I think that concludes our seminar for tonight. Thanks again. Look forward to seeing all of you at a future seminar. Have a good evening.
All right. See you, Marianne.
Thank
you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.